Alright, seriously, who doesn't know who Sonic is? I mean, come on, the guy defined a fucking generation of gaming. Even if the definition is somewhat laughable in retrospect.
What Nintendo?
Still, the games he was in were fantastic for a good long while, and the franchise still holds a lot of weight despite its many missteps. But what's fascinating about this franchise is not its games, but its legacy. These games went from being top dog and able to go toe-to-toe with gaming's biggest names, but still went straight to hell somewhere along the way. I mean, what the fuck? How do you cock something up so royally? A lot of people say it was due to the change into 3D with Sonic Adventure on the Dreamcast, but back then it was met with mostly good reception. Sonic Adventure 2 was the same way. Besides, lots of other franchises made the transition just fine. Some of the most revered games in all of history are from when franchises made this transition. Look at Zelda with Ocarina of Time. Hell, look at Sonic's main competitor Mario with Super Mario 64. These are gaming legends, so it can't just be adding a plane of existence into the equation that jacks up a game's mojo. What really happened? What actually changed? Is it just nostalgia playing into our minds? Why was Sonic so good to begin with? Was he really that good at all? Were we all just tricked by this blue bomb, blur, swept off our feet by its astonishing speed and alluring long spines? What all made this series so iconic to the point that the later games failed to build on this reputation? And who the fuck is this asshole stealing my shit? This is a large problem to tackle, so we'll have to chunk it up into different parts. So far, Sonic's history can be broken down into 3 different eras: the 16-bit era, the homing attack era, and the Mach era. Today's topic will be about the 16-bit era, going from his first game up until Sonic & Knuckles, for our purposes anyway. We only care about the good 2D platformers, so none of this, and none of that, thank God. We'll talk about the other 2 eras another time, but the best place to start for now is, well, start. Yeah, right. Let's take a look at Sonic's humble beginnings, which honestly were anything but. To begin with, let's focus on the main point everyone talks about with Sonic, his speed. There's no denying these games were meant to deliver a high-speed sensation. I mean, the game's acceleration models were made to deliver just that in a quick and manageable way. Your startup speed kinda sucks, but once you get going, you fucking move. Hell, in terms of gameplay, that's what set Sonic apart from the other platformers back in his day. Levels were designed to complement and encourage this rapid pace and made running forward fun. Except when they weren't designed that way. To show my point, look at the loopy-loops that are iconic for this series. They're made to show off just how fast he's moving by defying gravity itself! I like to see anyone else go that fast in a loop-de-loop and not smack their face straight in the ground. Another way speed is encouraged is through some of the power-ups. There's the simple running shoes that just make you more faster, but the cooler one is the invincibility power-up. Once you get it, you're no longer afraid of running into enemies and losing your rings. You've got free reign to just blast through the stages, and goddammit, you're gonna do that because it's fucking fun! Now, I'm not saying an invincibility power-up is all revolutionary or anything, but what makes them cool in these games is how the levels are made with in mind. The power-ups are placed in appropriate places, whether it be before a buttload of enemies, or spikes with the invincibility, or a long empty stretch for the running shoes. So not only are the power-ups designed to make running forward more fun, but the levels accommodate those power-ups in ways to allow you that awesome experience. So, yeah, simple yet elegant design. Again, not groundbreaking, but it helped the game be more fun. Another positive point for the level design were the multiple pathways you could take to reach the goal. These levels all usually had 2 or 3 different paths you could take to get to the end, and you could pick whichever one you could find or were good enough to get to. The higher paths took more skill to get to, but often got to the end quicker. This helps replayability by giving you different options to take each time you play a level, so you don't feel like you're doing the same thing over and over again, even though you are. It just feels different, but as long as it's fun, who cares? What made these designs genius was that if you messed up on the higher pathways and fell down, you'd just land on the lower paths and be able to continue as normal. You weren't really punished for not being able to pull off all that skill you might need in order to stay at the top all the time, but you're rewarded if you can with more rings or an extra life or just a shorter time on the level. Hell, in later games, you might find an extra way to get to the special stages. No downsides. Pretty cool. But even if we do believe that running around like a crack addict is neato, we have to understand why. Future Sonic games greatly enhance the sense of speed, but they're not necessarily more fun to play just because of it. Why is that? Well, that's because it's not just about the sense of speed that makes Sonic fun. It's the flow. Sonic's top speed in the 16-bit games isn't that high compared to today, but it's still fun to blast through the levels. This is due to the level design allowing you both the speed and control of the game. The games feel cohesive and strung together, and the motions of running and jumping go together fluidly to help you progress. This flow is what really makes Sonic game, hell any game, enjoyable to play. Now what is a Sonic game without the flow? Simply, it's a platformer. That's what the early Sonic games were made to be. but without that fluid feel, the game was nowhere near as fun. When you actually have to platform through a section like in the end of Sonic 1, or have to wait for an opportunity to jump safely to the next area, it's not enjoyable. It sucks. Fuck, Sonic's a platformer. Shouldn't the part where I platform be fun? Nah. Before we move on from gameplay stuff, it's important to note how these games evolved over time. If it was just the same game over and over again, they wouldn't be as celebrated and well-liked as they were, and, well, still are. The first Sonic game set the basis for the formula that most of the future games followed, and each new iteration after that brought a new, important change to how the game was played. For Sonic 2, it was the spin dash, which is integral to all the future 2D Sonic games. It really helps pick up your momentum when you lose it, and not keeping your speed up in these games is so detrimental to their appeal. Losing that momentum in the first game, sucked. It ruined a lot of the fun, and you had little way of gaining it back, which Sonic 2 helped to fix. Sonic 2 also introduced Super Sonic as a gameplay incentive to collect the Chaos Emeralds, rather than in the first game where some fat asshole laughs at you at the end of the game for not being able to traverse all these acid trips. Sonic CD gave you a more powerful version of the spin dash called the Super Peel Out that made you run faster but left you vulnerable unlike the regular spin dash. In Sonic 3 they put in the new shields that let you double jump, breathe into the water, and you had an early version of the homing attack. You could fly the tails. In Sonic and Knuckles you had Knuckles, and it had a really weird lock-on technology to unlock stuff in the previous games. And yeah. Sonic games got better with time. But the core didn't really change all that much. You just ran forward, got the emeralds, killed the boss, and then moved on. Which is a good thing, but also kind of bad. The core of Sonic staying the same means the flaws got carried with it in each game. For example, when Sonic isn't moving along, a ton is lost from it. Not much else other than running in Sonic is fun, since stuff like attacking enemies isn't satisfying or really the point of the game, and if you just stand around to enjoy the music or scenery, Sonic gets all pissy. The best thing to take from this is that the actual gameplay of Sonic is fun and neat and enjoyable. But it's not great, it's not amazing or novel. It's just good. So with only solid at best gameplay, there has to be some other reason these games were so successful. And there is! A couple actually, one being pretty colors! A large part of what makes Sonic so appealing and fun to play is the environments you're given to run through. They're a wonder to look at and convey this whole other world full of ancient temples and mechanical cities that are a joy to zoom past. This foundation of a fantasy setting is what the first Sonic game stuck to, and it worked out pretty well for them. This gave them the freedom to create all kinds of unique enemies and settings for the different games. This kind of creativity was spawned by not only talent, but also limitations. The thing is, at least when compared to today's standards, games didn't have the ability to put in a lot of detail into their worlds. They had to stylize their game's graphics in order to stand out. Early Sonic games did this extremely well, with each game advancing its art style. For example, in Sonic 1 the levels all focused on only a color or two for each stage to make each one look and feel distinct. Sonic 2 expanded a little on this by having two main colors for both foreground and background, as well as adding little splashes of detail along the pathways. After that, both Sonic 3 and Knuckles then focused on environmental themes, and used many different colors to illustrate whole themes and motifs, and often changed those themes within the same zone. Each game had their own visual design in this way, and used their respective techniques really well. Not only were the settings fun, but the enemies had neat touches to them as well. They all had an animal-like theme and silly, sinister looks about them, which kept to the colorful, bright theme Sonic had set for itself. The enemies helped establish the world you were in by either contrasting or complementing the environment. They felt super out of place in these lush areas you were visiting in the beginning, but by the end they fit right in with the ships full of machinery or whatever factory you were barging into to ruin a hard-working man's day. These aspects made it fun just being in those places, and you never really felt like any one zone was exactly like the other. Well, okay, except for the hill stages, but those aren't too offensive since they still look pretty. The games definitely had quality in environments, but they also had quantity. I mean, look at Sonic 2. In this game, there are a total of 10 different zones to play in, and for the most part, they're all cool to be in. At the very least, they were different, which helps the simplistic design of Sonic's good gameplay not get boring over time. And not only that, but the variety of different places encourages you to make it to the next level quicker, just to see what it looks like. This helped create the sense of speed Sonic is so well known for, and it's you, the player, deciding to do that. Yeah, that's right, they were able to use the game's looks in order to entice you to make the game feel fast and fun. That's fucking insane! Now, being pretty is great and all, but a good game needs more than that. With games, you have to please the three senses a player will use to interact with said game. One is feel, one is looks, and one is a rockin' soundtrack! Look, I'm no authority on music, or even know what makes a song good, but I can at least say the music in Sonic games is pretty damn fitting and catchy. I mean, come on, some of the riffs and issues in the third game had ties to Michael Jackson, which, hey, I've heard he's made pretty good music. And it seems every platform he appears on, whether it be a 16-bit console or an 8-bit one, Sonic brings sweet tunes with him. Sonic City deserves special mention for its music with its addition of different instruments and voice, and also because not a single one of you can say Sonic Boom is a bad song and go to bed guilt-free. But even without the guitars and vocal stuff, the chiptune music stands pretty well on its own. They gave the environments their own vibe, with happy uplifting music in the early areas to electronic and mechanical in the end stages. What makes the music so catchy is the excellent use of the bass line. Every single piece has its own beat, and no good song is anything without its flow. The background music also easily repeated into itself, since the songs aren't that long due to how brief the levels were. This led to short, catchy tunes that were enjoyable to hear over and over again. Now all of this so far has been establishing why the games were good enough to plant themselves on the throne of gaming in the 90s. However, there's one other really important tidbit that made Sonic who he is today, and it has absolutely nothing to do with the games themselves. Sounds weird, but it's what almost any game, hell, any piece of entertainment needs to succeed, especially back when word of mouth wasn't so widespread by things like today's social media. And that, my friend, was big loads and globs of money. Sega marketed the absolute shit out of these games. The first game, it was revealed and advertised with the band tour in Japan. In America, it was advertised like the whole Genesis yeah, you remember. Bullshit and the whole edgy feeling they were trying to evoke with that in Sonic. Sega of America was super aggressive in making Sonic popular by taking Nintendo on directly. This led to a bunch of weird-ass commercials and media attention, but hey, that's what they wanted. One big reason Sonic was so recognized back then was because Sonic 1 got bundled with the Genesis at a lower price point than the Super Nintendo. So of course, if people didn't really give a shit, they're gonna go buy the less expensive system, and then, hey, here's the Sonic game, let's play it. Oh, this is pretty cool! And it was! This led to mass appeal and mass success for the Sonic franchise, so much so that they would do another bundle like this with Sonic 2. Speaking of that game, they made what was called Sonic Tuesday to celebrate its release. It was this big event where they released it on the same day in North America and Europe. They made a huge deal about it, and it helped make the game the best seller on the Genesis. Sonic 3 had Hedgehog Day, which was a similar holiday-like event to make Sonic cool and relevant to a wide audience. They marketed the holy hot hell out of Sonic because they needed to. They needed to put all their chips and bets on him. So, it's not just the games were good, it's not just the games were pretty and sounded awesome, it was, hey, money. With this in mind, it can be seen that the reasons for Sonic to be a huge success weren't all entirely genuine. I'm not saying these games are bad, far from it in fact, but they didn't stand entirely on their own for the giant landmark experiences they claim to be. It's not like they're perfect and beyond reproach, because let me tell you, even if I can say all these nice things about Sonic, he's definitely got his share of issues. Like most indie games, these ones have their flaws, but the flaws these Sonic games have are extremely interesting. They not only have problems that future games try to solve, but also have issues at the very core of their concepts that make these games extremely hard to produce, especially in today's world, which might help explain why Sonic games aren't as loved anymore. But let's point out the flaws first, so we know which bats to properly beat them with. Going back to these games is honestly kinda hard. It's still super fun in the beginning, but the games have all a strange, creeping trend about them. The deeper you go into the games, the harder they got, which, I mean, no shit, that's what happens in basically every game. It gets boring if the challenge doesn't increase with your skill, right? But here's the thing. Your skill doesn't increase in these Sonic games. All they're about is running forward. Sure, you have to jump over spikes and hit enemies and deal with Eggman's silly balls, but there isn't that much the games do to teach you to play them better. Which isn't a huge deal, there really isn't a reason for them to teach you how to play better for you to have fun or progress. Until you get near the end parts of these games. You see, games are made differently in the early 90s. They weren't terribly long, since they usually weren't that complex. Unless you delved into the lands of the JRPG, then all this reasoning is thrown out the fucking window. Still, games needed some sort of way of lasting long in order for people who played them to not feel like they wasted their hard-earned coin on this virtual nonsense. A very common way for games to do this was inherited from the arcade days by making parts of the game stupid fucking hard in very cheap or unfair ways. Sonic is no fucking exception! Near the end parts of Sonic games, levels focus much more on platforming rather than a sense of speed, which is very much not what a Sonic game is about. When you get to these sections of the game, it feels like you were tricked. Suddenly you're dying over and over again due to some conveniently placed spikes, or some crushing walls, or an endless number of bottomless pits! Ugh! As a platformer, Sonic ain't that great. This is due to the aforementioned acceleration model in his games. His startup speed is slow, which makes jumping hard. When you're carefully jumping from place to place, you're jumping from a standstill, which means you don't jump very far due to your low startup speed. Once you do pick up speed in midair, it's very easy to overshoot your jump and miss your mark, which in the later levels often means an untimely death. Great stuff. This became even more difficult when you were Supersonic because of the precise platforming you needed. You couldn't possibly have the control because Supersonic's acceleration is so high. So when the games do focus on this aspect, the experience suffers for it. Weird how the game is bad at its core concept, huh? The game's platforming is at its worst in underwater levels, which are the bane of every platformer ever. Your movement speed is slow, which is directly against what a Sonic game is about, plus jumping becomes even harder. Nothing about being underwater is fun. They do try and enforce the fast pace of the game in these levels by giving you an air limit. There's a timer that ticks down the longer you stay underwater, and unless you find an air bubble supply and get lucky enough for one to pop up, you will die hands down the most terrifying death in any of the Sonic games. The tension that this awful death creates is awesome, but actually traversing the levels isn't fun in the way a Sonic game is meant to be. You asshole! Why did you take that from me? Platforming wasn't the only major part of these games they sucked at. No, Sonic games also fell flat when it came time to face the Fat Man himself. Boss fights are one of the few exceptions to Sonic's level design where most of the point around them is to fuck you instead of be fun. I'm not gonna think about what I just said. In the first game, if you die during a boss fight, you'll oftentimes get brought back to a checkpoint with no rings between you and the boss. And for the later bosses, you couldn't backtrack to collect any more rings to keep your spiny ass from biting the dust again. The bosses weren't too terribly hard, so this wasn't that big of a deal, but if you were having trouble with the boss, you were kinda fucked because of it. Which sucks! It's not like the boss fights were well designed or even that well connected to the rest of the gameplay anyway. These encounters were more or less stacked against you by hindering the two ways you avoided death, one being rings and the other being movement. Your movements were highly impaired because you really only have that one box area thing they leave you in to move around and don't give you any rings to help refill you in case you lose all yours. The worst boss fights, which coincidentally are also the worst parts of these games, are the final bosses. They're the most egregious offenders of a large difficulty spike, which turns the whole no rings thing into a large issue. And the final bosses are not only hard and cheap, but they also take one of the major gameplay mechanics of the games and use it against you. Supersonic. Now, the form itself is a really great addition to the game, and a great reward because you're a lot faster, you're invincible, and it gives you, this ultimate power, this feeling of, I accomplished something by getting all these Chaos MacGuffins, and now I'm super badass! But in these boss fights, it actually hinders you a whole fucking lot. To explain, they have these really long sequences before every final boss. In the second game, it's Sonic riding on a rocket to some space station. In the third game, it's Sonic riding in this little Eggman, boat thing as he watches the egg base launch into the air, and in Sonic and Knuckles, it's more so the fight itself is long and takes a while before you get to the actual challenge. The point is, they have these long sequences to where the purpose is to drain you of your rings if you happen to be supersonic. To clarify for anyone who doesn't know or remember, you had to collect 50 rings and jump into the air to turn Super Saiyan. Once you do this, the main drawback, which I think is a good part of Supersonic, is that every second you lose a ring because you're basically fueled on rings. This gives you incentive to keep collecting rings after you turn into Supersonic. It doesn't make you completely invincible throughout the entire level. You have to keep recharging yourself in order to keep this form, which I think is awesome. But they use it against you in these final parts of the games. It takes so long to get to the actual fight that you lose your form and your rings. So not only do they take Supersonic away from you so that you can't use that super form you've earned throughout this entire game to use on the final boss, but if you do have him at the end, he sucks away all your rings, so you have even less of a chance to do well at the final boss. Which is fucking stupid! Why would you do that? Why would you give us even less of a chance for the final boss? You wanna know why? Because back then, games were designed for you to die at the very end, or at some point in time. They were designed for you to purposely lose, because why else would you want to play a game again unless you haven't finished it yet? If you haven't finished the game yet, you still wanted to play it again at some point or another unless you got super pissed off at it, which is shitty design, but that's how they were made back then, because what else are you supposed to do? It sucks so much because Sonic has a very specific vision for itself that it executes really well when it focuses on that. But by using these design choices from the past, it changed Sonic for the worse, and it's awful! Look, still, all of these flaws and faults are very important to the Sonic series. They give a basis for how the next game in line can get better. All these blights get improved upon, or at least addressed in some future Sonic release. But there's one major downfall that's present throughout every Sonic game. A very subtle but very important problem that comes with the inherent design of Sonic. It's the problem of exploration versus progression. The main theme of Sonic is the great sense of speed and flow the game set out to deliver. The way the games do this is by blasting you forward through the level, pew, like a rocket, making that feel awesome through level design with the loops and jumps they sprinkle about. But it's the stuff that isn't solely meant to drive you forward that conflicts with this main point. Early on, this was in the form of rings and extra lives you saw in parts of the level that weren't in your main path but you wanted to collect anyway. So you would come to a stop, backtrack, and find a way to get that stuff, which ultimately isn't what makes Sonic fun. Now this doesn't seem like that big of a deal since there wasn't all that much to find. Except when you consider the Chaos Emeralds. These little extras are the main driver behind this problem since they're the main extra to collect. Getting a bunch of rings doesn't really matter unless you wanted to get that Chaos Emerald, which you did because you either got laughed at for not getting them or you weren't able to get the super cool powered up form. To complicate things further, Sonic 2 had you find goalposts in order to enter the special stages, which meant even more exploration since they weren't all in your main pathway. Sonic 3 and Sonic & Knuckles took this a step further by completely hiding the gateways as giant rings, which were out of your way entirely, and you had to waste time jumping into walls like a crazy person just trying to find them. This issue doesn't greatly impact the games, but it's important to note for later discussion of the future installments. But I'm sure you don't have the patience to hear about that, and I certainly don't have the patience to talk about that right now, so let's wrap this bad boy up! The gameplay of Sonic was simple. This was by no means a bad thing, since it didn't have to be more than that to be fun. Everything around it was awesome, and they didn't make you run around for very long before giving you a new environment to explore with a small new aspect with each level. Whether it be bumpers, or slot machines, or zip lines, or being underwater, or platforms. Alright, yeah, they weren't all humdingers, but still, playing the game was fun, and that's what it was about. The best of Sonic is when it's simple, short, and speedy. Not too many platforms to jump around on, the levels don't take longer than 3 minutes, and the level is made to help showcase what this hedgehog does best. Beautiful art, fantastic music, solid gameplay, and a healthy budget is what made these games work. The 16-bit games are the prime examples of these qualities, and more than deserve to be among the high watermarks of video games. That doesn't mean the formula can't be changed, nor is it anything to live or die by, because it definitely has some pretty heinous problems, but they ultimately don't destroy what can be seen as a unique and just fucking cool thing to fun around with. So, now the question stands. How is this formula followed up in 3D? Well, that's a lesson for another day. Seriously? Fuck you!